Hi. Okay. So the last part of this section we're going to talk about is injuries and abuse. This really does well, for the injuries part, we're going to talk about first. But both of them have three levels of prevention, and they're the same. They have the same kind of names, and they are basically the same sort of understanding, but applied, of course, a little bit differently. So we'll talk about these and what that means. Accidents and injuries, the leading cause of death worldwide for people under age 40. And among 2 to 6-year-olds, 4 times more children die in accidents than die of cancer, which is the second. Why is this? Well, if we go back to our brain development, it makes sense. If we look at the difference, if we look at, we bring together the fact that these children are just learning to become coordinated. Their bodies are not greatly coordinated, but they're also very emotional and they're very impulsive, and they don't have a developed PFC, which holds them back from behaviors that adults hopefully would hold back from. They don't know their own lack of coordination, or they're quite fearless in some ways, but it comes more from just not knowing, from a lack of knowledge of what could be possible or not possible. So as they have accidents. They have accidents as they try things that they're not ready to do, not understanding they're not ready to do that, wanting to try it, not having the emotional regulation not to do it. And as right now they'll have, when we talk about cognitive development, goes into this too, though. They have not a lot of logic, but a lot of magical thinking. So as their pretend play is really strong, and they think they can fly, they think they can do things that they can't, they're being superheroes or princesses or whatever, and they're trying things, and they're not very well coordinated. Their little bodies can't do everything they think they should be able to do, and they have accidents. So there's 3 levels of prevention we talk about. Primary prevention. So primary prevention so think about this as moving, this all moves inward. Primary prevention is in the big picture, the more global picture, actions that change overall background conditions. So we're going to take, for instance, say, children in car accidents. Okay, so we might have laws that make us wear seatbelts, car seats, speed limits. So, we have sort of the big picture, the laws put into place at a global level to try to prevent accidents, car accidents from happening, and especially keeping children safe within cars and so forth, not sitting in the front seat, sitting backwards till a certain age. All these things can be primary prevention matters. Secondary prevention is then going to say, okay, where's our high-risk situation? Where is it that most car accidents, maybe involving children, could happen? In neighborhoods where children live, we might have speed bumps. We might have slower speed limits, school zones. We are going to have crossing guards in place. We're going to have even slower speed zones, speed bumps. We're going, all of these things crosswalks are going to happen in secondary prevention. So primary, we have the big global look. Secondary, we have our high risk areas, and we have more things in place for that. Tertiary then isn't really so much a prevention of the accident, but a prevention of so making it worse, or death or something. It's immediate and effective medical treatment once an accident has happened, aimed at reducing harm or preventing disability or death. So if it happens, what do we have in play? We have 911, we have response rates, we have things, ambulances, fire truck, things that come into play to happen quickly so that we can reduce the harm that's done once something has already happened. So global, high risk, then actions put into place immediately to prevent, reduce amount of harm once something has happened. So that's basically the 3 levels of prevention that I think are good to know about. All right. Hard subject, child maltreatment. Maltreatment is considered intentional harm to or unavoidable endangerment of anyone under 18 years of age. It can include both abuse and neglect. If you've watched all the videos I've ever put up, then you've seen child neglect and child abuse. You've seen the child neglect at work, and that it's very damaging to the architecture of the brain and that building architecture as a child grows. Failure to meet child's basic physical, educational, or emotional needs. And some studies that, long-term neglect is actually more dangerous to the brain and to the child than like a case of abuse. Now, of course, ongoing abuse oftentimes also includes neglect of emotional or educational needs, and of course will be even more damaging. We're never going to know how much there is. And why are we not going to know how much there is? Because there's going to be some that's never reported. And even those that are reported maybe can't be substantiated, because once they're reported, there's no longer proof. Harm or endangerment about which someone has notified the authorities is reported, 3.5 million a year in the U.S. That was at the time of the text, but substantiated harm or endanger that has been reported, investigated, and verified, 1 in 80. Seems very high. I mean, it's too much. It's all too much, right? It's all too much. So warning signs of, maltreatment or abuse: delayed development, slow growth, PTSD. If the child is fearful, startled, has a very hyper startled response, very defensive. If they do fantasy play around violence or sex, they seem to have continued physical complaints, repeated injuries. Hypervigilance is actually also part of PTSD. That hypervigilance is just always being on watch, looking for the threat. Absences from school, if they don't want to go home, they're afraid of the caretaker. All of these seem, of course. Now, here's the thing. If we work in a school system or in a medical system, or we work anywhere with children or with people, we have to remember that there are many potentials of why a child displays something. So if a child comes into a classroom and they're got their head down and they're not listening, and a teacher can look at that from many different angles. It could be the child's just bored, the child doesn't care, the child's rude. It could be the child doesn't get to eat breakfast. It could be the child is kept up late at night with fighting in the home, or there is abuse going on, or there is neglect and they have to care for other children in the house and they have to care for themselves. They don't have a place to sleep. There's so many different potentials of why something happens. It could be that they just don't sleep well, or they refuse to eat, or they are bored. Many different things. And that's why jumping to conclusions is never good either, but looking at signs and communicating this to whatever the hierarchy and wherever we are is. Like I'm a mandatory reporter as an instructor at Front Range. And, so we have to know, are we mandatory reporters? And we have to report incidences of concern. And if we're in a medical community, many of you looking at coming into that, I know when my son broke his elbow, and we went to the hospital, I know that the nurse that greeted us in the ER looked directly at my son, and I'm sure this is what nurses are directed to do, and asked him how it happened, and and I know that they were looking to make sure that he had not been harmed by his father or me. And, of course, as a mother who would never, I was like, oh. And of course, as my son, who's just very timid, is looking at me, looking for answers almost. I'm like, oh, okay, answer yourself. But, we have to be aware of these things because unfortunately they happen. And so I do understand it. But we also have to remember that in children, there's many different potential threads involved. Consequences of maltreatment: severely maltreated children suffer physiologically, academically, and socially in every culture. And we have to remember these things are never compartmentalized. They're never separated. When we suffer physiologically, if our body suffers, maybe with malnutrition or, malnourishment or whatever, then our brain suffers. When our brain suffers in the right, or if the brain suffers, if we're not given the right care, the brain suffers. We don't grow the correct, our neurons don't grow, firing and wiring together, and then our academics, and then we may not be sleeping, and then our academics or our emotions are so high, or there's so much going on and we're embarrassed and we don't know who to talk to. So all of these things tie in together to create a working model of the self for the child, that is unfortunate and dangerous in some, that they're not worthy of care. They don't trust also the working models that they have created of other people not to be trusted. So remember, try to keep in mind that even though you learn these in compartmentalized ways, all these things are working together and integrating. Maltreated children come to consider other people to be hostile and exploitive. That's a working model that they're going to create through maybe their attachments or whatever has happened with whomever has happened, making them fearful, aggressive, and lonely. That they are creating coping mechanisms based on the experiences that they're having, that their brain is wiring according to these, that they're implicitly learning. Their memories are in their way of responding to the world, and their core self is growing in accordance with these situations and experiences. The earlier abuse starts and the longer it continues, the worse their peer relationships are. Well, of course. They don't want people to know. They're embarrassed, they're afraid. And if, the people that are supposed to be taking care of them are not, then there's confusion that can happen. So we have 3 levels of prevention again. Primary is going to be that global again. Any measure that reduces financial stress, family isolation, and unwanted parenthood. So things that a society might do to help alleviate difficulty for parents. Secondary prevention is going to be, who are the high-risk children? What has there seen? Social workers, and then targeting high-risk children, home visits by, nurses, high-quality daycare, social work, all designed to high-risk families. Those who are at high risk, well, we know that SES can play a role because the more stress there is in a family, financial stress there is in a family, the more harsh parenting can take place. And the lower the SES, the more maybe the inability or lack of resources for being able to take care of. Young parents, and these are just correlations. There's not a causation here. Correlations they have seen, that there's higher stress in younger parents, potentially. And so, just being aware of, watching out for potential high-risk areas. Tertiary prevention reduces harm when maltreatment has occurred, requires permanency planning. What are we going to do with children who have been abused or maltreated in any way? We do know now that institutionalization is not a great answer, is not an answer. And so permanency planning, how do we plan for these children to be permanently taken care of? Through foster care, but hopefully through kinship care or adoption, where they have a home that brings them in for the long term. I mean, foster care can be fabulous. We want ultimately for children to have long-term care by people who take them in through either kinship with a relative or adoption. And so that is going to be it for this part. And so until next time, be well, watch the videos, take care.